Hello and welcome to another episode of Who Knew in the Moment, the podcast. I'm your host, Phil Friedrich, and today I'm honored to have Alan Stein Jr. with me. Alan is an amazing keynote speaker. He has a great podcast. He's an author of multiple books. He does a lot of speaking in the sports world. And I'm super excited to have him on. And I think one of the biggest takeaways you're going to have is that if you have direction of where you want to go in your life, figuring out how to get there is just a byproduct of where you want to go. So, Alan, thanks so much for being on today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. This is going to be fun.
Yes. So to start your story and your journey, growing up, parents are both teachers. So, there's certain things that we see when we have our parents be educators. And you also fell in love with basketball around like 5 years old. So talk a little bit about, growing up, having parents as teachers, and then also finding basketball and falling in love with that.
Well, my parents were unbelievably supportive of anything my younger brother and I wanted to try. And most of my endeavors, meaning 99.9% of them, were in the sports world. I was a very active kid. Anything where I had an opportunity to burn off some energy and move my body, I was interested in, and played and did all sorts of sports and activities, all the conventional sports, baseball and football and soccer and obviously basketball, but did a lot of unconventional sports like martial arts and BMX biking and skateboarding. But everything always led back to basketball. So basketball was really my first love. And I'll get into that in a moment of why I'm so thankful that here 4 decades later, basketball is still a major pillar of my life. But I think the most important lesson that my parents taught me, and this was never anything that they said, this was simply something that they modeled, was how much fulfillment they got out of their careers and their jobs as teachers. My mom was a first grade teacher for 30 years. My father started as an elementary school teacher and then went into administration and ultimately retired as a middle school principal. But the lessons they modeled for me, one is to enjoy and have fulfillment in your work. Two is to feel like you are making a meaningful contribution to someone or to something. And, my parents were very passionate about pouring into young people and kind of, guiding and molding the future of the world, if you will, as cliche as that sounds. So for them to be able to model doing something you find purpose and value in and doing something you enjoy and find fulfillment in has kind of always been my North Star. And to take it a step further, I had a middle school coach give me what to this day I still consider the single best advice I've ever been given. Wow. And he said that the key to true happiness and fulfillment and high performance and success is finding your strength zone. And your strength zone is the intersection between what you love and what you're naturally pretty good at. Figure out what you're passionate about and figure out where your natural talents lie. And wherever those two things intersect, the more time and energy you can invest in that intersection, the better your return. And, my intersection has changed a few times over my career, but I've always stayed true to that advice. And basketball has been within a couple degrees of everything I've ever done since I was 5 years old.
So there's so many good nuggets in there that I want to dive into, and a couple of them are going to come up in your story as we talk. But I think one of the, impactful things that you mentioned is it wasn't necessarily something that my parents taught me, but I saw it, right? I caught that from them. And I think oftentimes when we're looking at, our role models, we're like, well, I don't know if I want to be a teacher per se, but it's like, well, what things could you see, right? Do you see somebody showing that they love what they do, right? And it's like, all right, the passion that they have for whatever they're important, how do I find that for myself?
Absolutely. And I love that you brought up that it was caught, not taught. I love that concept. And it's something I hold dearly now that I'm a father, and making sure I'm modeling, the types of behaviors and decisions and perspectives that I hope my kids are paying attention to. Interestingly enough, when I went to college and I was able to play basketball, it was Elon College at the time. It's now Elon University down in Burlington, North Carolina. I knew I wanted to do something in the world of sports, specifically basketball, but I didn't have a lot of direction on what that could be when I was first going to Elon. So I figured I would follow in my parents' footsteps and be a teacher. But the goal was that the teaching part was going to be heavily overshadowed by the coaching part. I figured I could be a high school gym teacher but do my real passion of coaching basketball. And it didn't quite unwind that way. And thankfully it didn't. It actually put me on a path to then do what I did for almost 20 years after college, which was become a basketball performance coach and help players improve their athleticism, their movement, their mindset, their nutrition. But yeah, I saw and had so much reverence and respect for teachers, for coaches, and knew how much my parents enjoyed it. When I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, I figured I'd give that a try.
I love that. Now, we'll come back to you playing basketball, but since you're on that topic, there's a day where you're student teaching and the teacher says, "Hey, let's go out and you guys need to collect leaves." And you have this moment of like, is this really what I'm going to do the rest of my life? So, talk a little bit about that, especially when, maybe your mind had been made up that you were going to do something, but all of a sudden it didn't work out or it wasn't playing out like you thought it would, and being willing to open up your mind and say, "All right, what is next?"
Yeah, well, the opening of the mind part is something I've always struggled with, especially in my younger ages. I had a wicked stubborn streak, and when there was something that I was into, like basketball, I was 100% in. When there
Mhm.
was something I was not into, I could not care less about it, and I didn't give it any effort. And I was a decent student in high school, but it's crazy when you go back and you look at my report card, which I haven't done in probably 30 years. But the subjects that I cared about and the teachers that I liked, I could get A's with very little
Mm,
effort. It just came
yeah.
natural. The subjects that I didn't care about and actually thought were pretty ridiculous, and the teachers I didn't care for, I mean, it was like pulling teeth just for me to get a C in that class. So, for good or for bad, when I'm all in, I'm all in. But when I'm out, I'm out. And that day that you referenced, where I'm doing some student teaching, and the teacher said we need to go out and collect leaves and kind of take a look at and naming the leaves and I could not care less about leaves. I thought that was the biggest colossal waste of anyone's time. And in that moment, I said, there's no way I'm going to spend the next 30 years telling people that leaves are important, because they're not important to me. And I say that with a smile, because there's absolutely no judgment for me, for anyone that does find leaves fascinating or does want to be an elementary school teacher. I'm so thankful for the people that do that. But I just knew that's not where my heart was, and there was no way that I could fake it. So literally, I left that class, went to my advisor, and said, I do not care about leaves. I don't want to talk about or see leaves for the next 30 years. I need to make a pivot. And
Yeah.
he started reading off a couple of majors that I could switch to at this point, where I wouldn't lose too many of my credits. And about third on the list was sport management. And all I heard was the word sport. I said, stop, I'll do that. Had no idea what sport management entailed, but I said, I'm going to switch my major from elementary ed to sport management. And looking back now, which I know is the entire purpose of your show and connecting the dots, it's accidentally one of the best decisions that I ever made, because as a sport management major, I took business classes, but as my electives, I also chose to take exercise physiology classes and biomechanics and biology, things that I would later need as a basketball performance coach. So when I graduated from Elon, I had walked backwards into the perfect major, half business, half exercise phys. And for someone who ended up running his own basketball training company for 20 years, it was the perfect collage of what I needed. But it was 100% accident.
Yes, I love that. Now, as you mentioned, you graduate and we're not going to be pursuing education anymore. And at some point, you get introduced to well, you get to be a part of the coaching staff on some of the top high school programs, I mean, in the country. But how did it start day one? Did you reach out to a few high schools, grade schools to help start coaching, or how did you kind of get your foot in the door to start the business?
One of the things I somehow picked up intuitively, because I don't remember anyone telling me this and I don't ever remember reading this, but I always figured out when you have a goal of doing something, find someone who's doing that thing and spend as much time with them as you can.
Yeah.
Figure out what they did to get where they are and learn from them.
Mm.
And there was a gentleman here in the Washington, D.C. area, which is where I grew up and where I currently reside, who was training NBA players. He was a personal trainer for a lot of the players that came out of Georgetown. He had befriended David Falk, the super agent, who represented most of those players.
Yeah.
And every time one of those players was going to leave Georgetown for the NBA, he sent them to this guy to work out with. And in my mind at that time, I thought that was the perfect job for me, being a personal trainer for NBA players. And to take one quick step back, while I was at Elon as a basketball player, I started to develop a love for lifting weights and plyometrics and strength and conditioning and nutrition. It was something I was really fascinated with. So when I graduated from Elon and I realized I didn't want to be a teacher, and I also realized that I didn't have what it took to play basketball professionally, even at a very low level, I knew I had to make a switch. So I decided to combine my original love of basketball with this newfound love of strength and conditioning. And I decided I wanted to be a basketball performance coach. And that's where I researched and found this gentleman who was training these Georgetown players. So I would write him letters, physical handwritten letters back then. This is still a little bit before cell phones. I would leave messages, I would fax, and then when I would come home on breaks from Elon, I would go in to visit this guy and introduce myself and basically said, look, you are doing exactly what I want to do. Just let me know what I need to do to spend time with you. I will be an intern. I'll be an apprentice. I'll mop the floors. I'll wash the towels. I'll do anything that you need in exchange for you somewhat mentoring me or modeling or letting me shadow you. And thankfully, he was kind enough to take me up on that. And I spent just under a year as kind of an unpaid intern, glorified apprentice, just kind of soaking it up. And it was an incredibly invaluable experience. I learned a lot about business. I learned a lot about the training space. And then after a year, I decided I was ready to kind of do that on my own, and also had an appreciation that, after 1 year, NBA players weren't going to be knocking on my door, that I kind of had to start at the bottom and start working with middle school kids and high school kids. And I was committed to doing that. And at that time, the goal was to matriculate up until I could eventually work with NBA players. And I realized also at that time that there was a lot of gold to be found in the middle school and high school age, because not only could I help them improve their athleticism on the court, I could also serve as an important role model and male figure in their lives off the court. So I ended up kind of redirecting my goal and not being so enamored with the NBA, but really loving the high school space. And then there were 2 different high schools here in the Washington, D.C. area that had international prominence. The first was Montrose Christian, whose most famous alum is Kevin Durant. The other was DeMatha Catholic High School, who's had dozens of famous alums, but the most recent, Victor Oladipo, Markelle Fultz, Jeremy Grant. They've had some really good players. And I used that exact same tactic and the exact same persistence that I used with faxing and emailing and calling to get into those schools as well, and spent 13 years, 7 at Montrose and 6 at DeMatha, working with the best high school players in the country, which then opened doors for work with Nike and Jordan Brand and USA Basketball, which then opened up even more doors. So I know that was a mouthful. I can unpack any of that you want, but it all started with this desire to just say, hey, you're doing what I want to do. How about I follow you around for a little bit and try and figure it out for myself?
Yes. So you're right. There is a lot to unpack, and we're going to. But I think where my head goes on what you were first talking about is, you had said earlier, hey, when I'm really into something, like I'm into it, right? I'm dedicated. And that's clearly, a sign of all the things you did to get in with the trainer, to get in with the high school. It's like you were dedicated. The second part of me also says, you said, when I'm dedicated, I'm all in. And so my question was, sometimes that can be counterintuitive to coachability, right? Like if I'm super zoned in, I want to do it my way, but then also being able to do it your way and have the ability to be coachable can be a different element. Not everyone listening right now is a basketball coach or a basketball player, right? But there's a lot of people that are in roles where they need to coach someone that's, a lasered in focused person, or there's someone that's lasered in sales and they need to be more coachable. So talk a little bit about that balancing act for you of, hey, you were dedicated to what you wanted, but you were also really, it sounded like, coachable in regards to you wanted to learn from people that were already doing what you wanted to be doing.
For sure. I'm so glad you went in this direction, and what an insightful observation. What I conveniently left out was the reason after only a year of kind of interning and apprenticing for this guy, I went out on my own, was because I thought I could do it better than him. I figured, hey, a year of watching this is enough.
Yeah.
I can do this better than he can, which was really an arrogant point of view. Because at that time, that guy had been training for 20 years.
Mm.
And I somehow figured that in 1 year, I'd crack the code and could do it better. So with my youth, there was some unbridled confidence, borderline arrogance, and impatience, which are
Yeah.
things that have plagued me my whole life. I mean, it's funny now that I can look back at almost 50 years old and kind of laugh at the younger Alan, at how impatient and how arrogant and how stubborn and how judgmental I used to be. But
Mm.
I've also forgiven my younger self, because that's the journey I was on. That's
Yep.
where I was at that moment. And it's funny because looking back now, not only do I realize how little the 22-year-old Alan knew then, but how much more the 48-year-old Alan still has to learn and still has to explore. So I have a much stronger appreciation for that process. But things happen for a reason. So
Yeah.
I decided to stop working for him. I figured I'd learned everything that I could learn from him in a year, and decided to do my own thing, and, built a respectable business, but certainly stepped on plenty of landmines and made plenty of my own mistakes. So I don't regret that decision, but it's just funny to me now that my impatience, I was looking to skip steps. I was looking to do what someone who had been training for 20 years was doing, and I was looking to do those same things in year number 2.
Yeah.
So, somewhat lesson learned. And the nice part is, by learning those lessons then, when I decided to leave the basketball space in 2017 and become a corporate keynote speaker, I didn't repeat those same mistakes. I had a much better understanding of patience and process. And even though I'm going into year 8, and even though I'm running a successful speaking business, I'm still in this for the long term. And I
Yeah.
realize how many more bricks that I need to lay on my foundation to really get the speaking business where I want it to go. Whereas when I was younger, I was just so impatient and in such a hurry to try and accomplish things. So back to your point of balancing kind of confidence with humility is
Yeah.
what allows someone to stay open to coaching.
Mm.
And I've always believed in the power of confidence. Confidence is earned through demonstrated performance. Confidence is earned by the little voice in our head and how we speak to ourselves. Confidence is earned by keeping our word to ourselves. So
Yeah.
those things are all earned during the unseen hours. But what's so important is that no matter how confident you deserve to be, you brush that with a stroke of humility, because
Yeah.
humility is what allows you to stay open to coaching.
Yep.
Humility is what allows you to stay open to feedback. Humility is what allows you to remind yourself that no matter how good you get, you can still get better. That you
Mm.
never actually hit the proverbial ceiling of your potential. Now, you might get to a razor's thin edge, but you never actually hit it, or you shouldn't actually hit it.
Yeah.
So to me, where I have much more humility in my late 40s than I did in my early 20s, it's allowed me to kind of balance out that confidence. And there's no question that today, even though I have very strong opinions and perspectives and beliefs, I am way more coachable at 48 than I ever was at 22. Like many 22-year-olds,
Yeah.
I thought I had all the answers and I thought I knew everything.
Yep. I love it. Now, with that, you talk about transitioning and you go to Montrose, which once again is a big time high school. I mean, when ESPN was just kind of starting to have high school games on, right? They were one of the teams, them and Oak Hill, right? I mean, one of very few teams that were getting TV publicity. There's also part of me that says, was there any party that's like, did I really just go from working with NBA players to now I'm working with, 14, 15, 16-year-old kids that someday I can help, maybe get to the NBA, but I'm potentially taking a step back from like caliber of person that I'm working with. So talk a little bit about, being willing to do that. Cause I think so many people want to do the NBA route, right? Like everyone wants to work with the NBA players, but being willing to, work with a high school and really grow. And then also just the impact that you can have at that age.
Well, I was fortunate that the coach at the time at Montrose Christian was a gentleman named Stu Vetter, who is a Hall of Fame caliber coach. He's one of the brightest basketball minds I've ever been around. And Montrose was his fourth stop.
Yeah.
He had been at 3 private schools before that and had built up a national reputation. I mean, by the time he got to Montrose, he had already had several players in the NBA. One of his most famous was Dennis Scott. And
Yeah.
I know that's, kind of aging where we are in the chronology of all of this, but he had already proven that he had put players in the NBA, and he had put hundreds of players into major Division I programs. So I knew that this was not a typical high school. I knew
Yeah.
that the caliber of players at Montrose had the potential to be not only Division I players, but future NBA players. So I never looked at it as a step back. I actually welcomed the challenge and the role and responsibility of saying, I did get a chance to work with some NBA guys when I was an intern and an apprentice, but they weren't my guys. Like
Yeah.
I was training them on behalf or helping on behalf of someone else. Where now I can go work for a high school, get in while these players are younger and still, somewhat moldable, and potentially they could be NBA players, and then they would be my guys. And I say that with a smile. No, implication of ownership or they were my, like, I knew there was nothing guaranteed, but I thought, what could be cooler than working with a 14 or 15-year-old, and 6 or 7 years later, that person's name is called in the NBA draft. So I never looked at it as a step down.
Yeah.
I looked at it as an opportunity to get in before players had really built up that name and that legacy. And it was a great opportunity. I also relished the opportunity to be a part of a team. That was
Yeah.
one of the things that was different about being an independent trainer, was you just worked with individual players. Whereas now I had an opportunity to actually work with the team. And my role at Montrose, I was at every practice. I led every workout. I went to every game. I sat on the end of the bench as if I was an assistant coach, which in theory I was. So I was fully consumed with being a part of that program, and I absolutely love that. And at high school basketball at that level is basically a college program for kids 14 to 18 years old. I mean, when you're a part of a Montrose Christian or a DeMatha Catholic high school, that program is run very similar to the way a Division I program is run. I mean, there's study hall, there's film sessions, there's workouts, there's early morning workouts before school starts. Those players were held to a really high standard, which is one of the reasons that the players that left Montrose and left DeMatha so easily acclimated to the college life, because they were used to all of that. Where many other freshmen, they get homesick. They're not used to study halls. They're not used to people yelling at them. They're not used to certain levels of accountability. Our players just walked right into college and were like, yeah, this is what I've been doing for 4 years. This is no problem. So I took a lot of pride in that and really enjoyed it.
Yeah. So on that note, one of the players that you mentioned earlier that was with you at Montrose was Kevin Durant. He, is a product of there. And I think, sometimes once again, down the road, you interact with Steph Curry at the Nike camp, and we'll talk about that. But I think, people look back at these players in hindsight and they go, well, I'm sure you just always knew they were going to be great. And it's like, well, it's easy to say that now because Steph Curry's the greatest shooter of all time. Kevin Durant's, one of the best players, of his era. And it's like, but they both had glaring maybe question marks next to him, right? Steph Curry's too small. Kevin Durant's really tall, but is he going to get pushed around? Like he what was his famous thing? He got one rep at the NBA Combine or couldn't even do one rep, right? And people were dogging on him for that. And you say, well, yeah, fast forward 10 years into their career and you go, why did you even have a question mark? But there were certain physical things that maybe limited them. But my question to you is, having gotten to work with them at such a young age or maybe early phase of their career, were there intangibles that you said, yes, those are going to be potential hurdles for them, at that high of a level, but they've got the extra work ethic or they've got the coachability or they just have the IQ that, other players just seemingly don't have as high of?
Well, I'll use KD as the example because
Yeah.
I had a much closer relationship with him, and I met him when he was 15 years old. And
Yeah.
the very short answer is I had no doubt he was going to be an outstanding player. But there is no way I would have forecasted that he'd be arguably the best scorer in the game over the last decade. I mean,
Yeah.
just pure scorer. So I knew he'd be great, but I had no idea he'd be this great. And the only reason I knew he'd be great was because he had, the tangibles and the intangibles. I mean,
Yeah.
you are correct. The glaring asterisk was that he was rather thin and slight of frame, and that could potentially hinder his ability to play at the next couple of levels. But what he did have was incredible athleticism and footwork. Like, you're talking about a kid that was 6'10", but could run like a deer and had great coordination and spatial awareness. And I mean, hand-eye coordination was off the charts. He also was very fundamentally sound. Even at a young age, Kevin had very smooth shooting mechanics. He had great footwork. He had a great IQ. Kevin really understood the game at a cerebral level, even at his young age, that would probably rival most coaches. Kevin also had a motor. Like, he loved the play. He loved the game of basketball, and he could just go all day long. I mean, there were very few things he'd rather do than be on a court putting up shots. So when you take a young man in a 6'10" frame with all of those traits, both tangible and intangible, and he was humble, he was coachable, he craved people helping him improve, which is one of the reasons we got along so well. He acknowledged that he was slight of frame and that needed to gain some strength and some power and put on some weight. And that was why we hit it off, because that's kind of what my job was as a strength and conditioning coach. So, while he never really enjoyed our workouts, which is kind of funny, he understood the importance of them, and he knew that he had to make that sacrifice in order to get where he wanted to go. So, he and I were thick as thieves for a couple of years, when he was in high school. So yeah, when you take all of those things together, and add a little bit of good fortune, he's been relatively injury free. He's played for a lot of different really good coaches and good programs, but you take all of that together and you get the perfect collage, which is now Kevin Durant being one of the best players to ever play the game.
Yeah, well, and so I love that you mentioned that, and I oftentimes, think of it in regards to Malcolm Gladwell's book, David and Goliath, right? And it's those seemingly things that you say, man, at 6'10", if he wants to play a four, like, he's gonna get pushed around. Well, at 6'10", wanting to play a four at his weight, he probably realized I should probably be a really good 3-point shooter, because if I'm gonna rely on myself trying to, post somebody up that's 6'10" as well, low probability I'm gonna be able to bully him in there. And so that seemingly, problematic area, or, maybe less opportunistic area, becomes his benefit, right? I'm sure he spent a lot of time out shooting 3-pointers, saying, well, I'm going to have to be able to bring a bigger physical stature person outside, so that way I can either drive around them or get a 3-point shot up on them.
Exactly. I mean, he understood that intuitively. And think about that. He's like, if I'm 6'10" and I'm playing the center position, I'm at a disadvantage. If I'm 6'10" and I'm playing shooting guard, I'm at a massive advantage. Who can guard a 6'10" shooting guard? And over the last decade in the NBA, the answer to that is no one.
Yeah, right.
No one can guard Kevin Durant when he's on the perimeter. Now, and he also kind of, set in motion tons of players that have followed that have said the same thing. They're like, I don't want to play with my back to the basket down on the post. I want to be out shooting threes like Kevin Durant. So he kind of, in some way, shape, or form, changed the game a little bit. I mean, I think a lot of that, if we're being fair, started with Kevin Garnett, who similar stature, but Kevin Garnett was never the scorer shooter that KD developed into. So I think that was ultimately what Kevin had, was very high self-awareness. He understood that even at his height, he had guard-like skills. He had an uncanny playmaking ability. He could see the court. He was a great passer, and he was a smooth as silk shooter, and he needed to use that to his advantage. And he has it every step of the way. So, a good lesson that we can all pull from that is to use what we have to our advantage. And if we have things that can on paper appear to be glaring disadvantages, we can mask that by having different roles or playing different positions or attacking things from a different way.
Well, and I want to highlight that in your story. I mean, obviously today is about you and your journey. And I think, gosh, think about Allen's journey if he would have went and played in the NBA. Maybe he was an extra, 6 inches taller, right? Or, whatever it is. And you just sit there and you go, well, that would have been really great and a unique opportunity. And maybe it would have opened up more doors earlier on to, train and develop players. But for you, I'm guessing, what that created was a tougher work ethic, right? That resilience factor, and that ended up opening up a bunch of doors for you. So although, I always think Jason Kidd, right? Because he was a great player, he just got the opportunity to coach. It's like, he had no coaching experience. They just said, oh, well, you're a good player, might as well be a coach. Allen didn't necessarily just have doors open for him because, well, you played at Elon University, so we'll, now give you this coaching job. But because you were resilient and you're disciplined and you're dedicated, doors were able to open based on your hard work.
I appreciate that. And I want to formally go on record and say I would have needed a lot more than just 6 inches of height to even be within a sniff of the NBA. That wasn't the only area I was significantly deficient, because I'm not short. I mean, I'm 6'2". So, but what I do think, and this is one of the main reasons I'm such a huge advocate of youth sports in general, and I consider high school still youth sports, is all of these traits and intangibles that sports can help instill. And
Yeah.
there's no doubt that when I realized my playing days were over, that I could accept that and had no problem with that. But how could I use all of the disciplines and mindsets and structures that I'd learned from the game? How could I use that in something moving forward, which I think is an important lesson for anyone. And yeah, it's all been part of a very interesting journey along the lines. And one of the things I think is so cool about this show is we don't realize most of those things until we have the gift of hindsight to look back. You know, we think things should be a certain way. They don't quite turn out that way. Sometimes we're pleased, and other times we're, you know, it's not our preference. But then looking back, we can say, yeah, that was one of the best things to ever happen. And for me, I can also readily acknowledge, you know, you mentioned Malcolm Gladwell, who's one of my favorite authors, but my favorite book of his is Outliers. And that
Yeah.
was a really impactful book for me. But part of my journey is attributed to the concept of outliers, which it's not just about being in the right place, it's also being in the right time. So for
Yeah.
context, I finished my career at Elon in 1998. In 1998, less than 1/3 of all NBA teams even had a strength and conditioning consultant at
Wow.
that time. You know, and the third of the teams that did, it was usually the biggest muscle-bound meathead at the local Gold's Gym who they just figured knew a lot about strength and conditioning. That person had absolutely zero expertise in basketball specific training. So that's 1998. Fast
Yeah.
forward to present day, where we're almost in 2024, where not only does every NBA team have a strength and conditioning coach, they have an entire performance department that
Yeah.
employs 30 or 40 full-time people that covers every aspect of human performance. So from 1998, where hardly anyone was doing it, to 2024, where it's literally its own industry, there's been a lot of growth. And the reason I say that is I got in at a really good time. My interest in basketball specific strength and conditioning peaked before the rest of the world paid much attention to it. To be
Yeah.
honest, the only person in the private sector that I was aware of making a living doing this, aside from the guy that I apprenticed for, was Tim Grover.
Grover. Yeah.
Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant and Charles Barkley's trainer, you know, and he was someone that from afar I had read magazine articles on, and this is at the budding stages of the internet, and I read some things on him and thought, well, here's a guy doing what I think I want to do, and he's making a really good living working with the best basketball players. So he kind of proved that concept and proved that that was something that I could do. So the reason I'm saying this is I got in at a good time. There was not
Yeah.
very much competition. You know, there was no one knocking on the door at Montrose or DeMatha to be the strength and conditioning coach except me. There was no
Yeah.
one who wanted to do the Nike Skills Academies or the Jordan Brand Classic or the McDonald's All-American game except me. I kind of created some of those positions. You know,
Yeah.
I had some friends that had worked at Nike that I had met because I was close with the Montrose Christian staff. And when they decided to start their summer skills academies in 2007, I said, well, have you thought about adding a strength and conditioning or performance component? Someone to warm the players up and stretch them out, someone to teach them exercises they can do when they go back home. And they said, no, we never thought of that. But if you'd like to do it, come on in. So I got in at a good time. You
Yeah.
know, again, fast forward to present day. You know, there's a long line of people that want to be the strength and conditioning coach at DeMatha, who want to work with Nike and Jordan Brand. So it wasn't that I was anything special, anything but. I just happened to get in at the right places at the right time. And then once I was in, I was able to prove my value and I was able to make the most of the opportunity. I'm not shortchanging myself, but I realized that if I would have been born 10 years later or tried to enter that space 10 years after I did, it would have been a lot harder. So to Malcolm Gladwell's point, I realized that I got into the basketball training world at the perfect time, and I was in the perfect place, DC area, where it's a mecca of high school basketball.
I love it. Now, to that, everything's going well at Montrose, but you end up deciding to make a pivot to DeMatha, who you've mentioned a few times. What was the catalyst to that? And I think maybe once again, I don't know the story, so you'll touch base on, but maybe tie into it. Sometimes I think people find something good and they just want to plateau and leave it there. Other times people find something good and they're like, but there could be a bigger opportunity. There could be something more, and they want to explore that. So talk a little bit about that for you in the transition there.
Well, it was kind of multifaceted. I mentioned Coach Stu Vetter was the coach at Montrose,
Yeah.
and at that time, Coach Vetter was biologically old enough he could have been my father. So there was always kind of this different dynamic where he was older and I was younger, and I really embraced that. I mean, he to this day is one of the smartest basketball minds I've ever met. I mean, his practices were flawless. His level of organization, his precision, what was amazing. And I learned so much in my 7 years there. But I'll also say, and I say this in full transparency, he came from a different generation of coaching.
Yeah.
He coached through fear.
Mm.
Now, he never cursed. He was more of a Dean Smith when it came
Yeah.
to the pleasantries of the game than a Bob Knight, but he absolutely coached with the same fear-based mentality of a Bob Knight. It
Yeah.
was clear that this was his program, and if you didn't do exactly what he said, you were out.
Mm.
And over time, I realized that I didn't want to be a fear-based coach. I
Yeah.
wanted to be a love-based coach. And while I had learned so much from Coach Vetter, I realized that my beliefs were not in alignment with the way he was doing things. So I figured after 7 years, I'd learned a lot. That program was invaluable to me. I will forever be grateful and indebted to Coach Vetter for giving me a chance. But I was ready to learn from someone else, and I was ready to learn from someone that coached in a different manner. And that was why I left to go to DeMatha, who at the time was led by Mike Jones. Now, Mike Jones is only 2 years older than I am.
Mm.
So instead of kind of this father-son age difference, it was more like a brother to brother. And Coach Jones very much coached through love. Now, he held players to an incredibly high standard of excellence, and he was hard on them, but it was never demeaning. He was always hard on them and demanding through love. And I figured, here's an opportunity for me to learn from a different coach in a different program who does things a different way. So none of this was about, I wasn't grateful for Coach Vetter or Montrose. I just realized it's time for me to do something different, and left and went and worked at DeMatha for almost the same period of time, a little bit less. I did 7 years at Montrose and then 6 years at DeMatha, and was fascinated by how many things they did, in a very similar way,
Yeah.
kind of the pillars of how you run and execute an elite basketball program, but then also how they did things vastly different. And
Yeah.
I think being exposed to both of those programs really helped me become a very well-rounded coach, and gave me a ton of new perspective. So, after doing that for 6 years at DeMatha, is when I decided to make the final, not final pivot in my life, but the next pivot or iteration, which was to leave basketball completely and become a corporate keynote speaker, which, being a motivational speaker, was something I was really interested in giving a try to.
Yes. Now, two stories I want to get to before we make that jump to corporate speaking. One was, as you were at a high school practice, once again, you guys have talented players constantly going to colleges. And one day, Coach K shows up, and you're like, this is a great opportunity to introduce myself and talk a little bit. And you sent a letter after. So talk a little bit about just that interaction and just, the personality of Coach K and the letter you sent.
Sure. It was in 2008. So I was still at Montrose at the time, and he, Coach K, came to recruit one of our players. And at this time, having read Leading with the Heart, his first book, as I was graduating Elon, he was really a coaching idol of mine. I mean, this was somebody that I just had so much reverence and respect for, and getting to meet him for the first time was kind of surreal. And he was kind enough to chat with me for 10 minutes before practice, and it was a pretty life-changing moment for me. And as you mentioned, I wrote him a handwritten note afterwards to thank him for his time, because I was raised kind of old school, that when people go out of their way to do something nice for you, you handwrite them a note. And I did, but was blown away that a few weeks later, he had handwritten me a note back, and basically said it was nice to meet me. He enjoyed hearing, about my training philosophy, my work with the team. And I just remember being blown away that, here this iconic coach, one of the most decorated and successful, if not busiest coaches in all of college basketball, could make the time to handwrite me a note back. That sent a very powerful message to me. And ever since that day, I have been relentless in returning phone calls and voicemails, text messages, and emails, because I figure if a coach at his level can handwrite me a note back, you better believe I can email you back or I can respond to your text message. So for me, one of my highest values is being very prompt and responding to everyone that I can. And that was a seed that was planted with that lesson I learned from Coach K.
I love that. Now, a second one is as you work in the Nike camp, and it's Kobe Bryant's Nike camp, and you're there, and I'm sure you've told this story more times than you care to admit, but I find it absolutely fascinating. You say, "Hey, when are you working out? I just like to come watch the workout." So, talk a little about showing up at 3:30, and the day that ensues.
Well, what I'll do is I'll give you the real quick Cliff Notes version, and I would encourage all of your listeners and viewers to go to my YouTube channel,
Yes.
youtube.com/Alan Stein Jr., and you can see a few different versions that'll have a little bit more of a theatrical appeal than me telling it now. But yeah, I'm working the Kobe Bryant Skills Academy in 2007. I asked if I can watch one of his private workouts. I go and watch the next morning, very early in the morning, and I remember at that time being very surprised that he really wasn't doing anything flashy. He wasn't doing anything sexy. He was just drilling down on the basics and the fundamentals. Now, he was doing them at an unparalleled level of intensity and an unparalleled level of precision and focus and detail. There was nothing casual about it, but the actual drills he was doing were very basic. And that surprised me. It was my assertion at that time he was the best player in the world. And I couldn't believe that the best player in the world was doing drills that I had done with middle school and high school age players. And when I asked him about it later that day at the Skills Academy, he said something to me that changed my life forever. He said the reason he was the best player in the world was because he never got bored with the basics. And that's something, again, I've tried to model and live my life on is focusing on the fundamentals and not getting bored with the basics. Now, in the game of basketball, the basics are obvious: shooting, passing, rebounding, defending, handling the ball. Well, it's important for everyone that's not a basketball player to figure out what are the basics that you need to focus on in your life. What are the fundamentals? What area of your life are you trying to improve? Are you trying to improve your ability as a financial advisor? Are you trying to improve your ability as a husband or a parent? Are you trying to improve? Figure out the area you want to level up, and then get crystal clear on what are the basic building blocks to being excellent at that thing, and then relentlessly work towards mastery of those fundamentals during the unseen hours. And if you can make that type of commitment, you will greatly increase your chance of being excellent in that specific area. So that's a commitment that I try and do in each area of my life. And with everything that I've shared with you so far, and everything I've shared on stage, and everything I've shared on page, please, I hope everyone listening, hear me out. I'm not coming from a place of mastery. This is all stuff I am still working on. Am I better about focusing on the fundamentals now than at any previous point in my life? Absolutely. But do I occasionally skip over them? Do I occasionally get drawn into a shortcut or a hack? Do I occasionally take my eyes off the basics and try and reach something that maybe I'm not ready for? I absolutely do. And I get in my own way just like everyone else. But the beautiful part is now I have a level of awareness. I can catch myself pretty quickly. When I find myself trying to skip steps in the speaking industry, I remind myself that I'm in this for the long haul and I got to get back to the basics. So I'm better than I've ever been at this, but I am far from mastery and certainly far from perfection.
Well, and so jumping into the corporate world and your books, I want to make sure we highlight those. One of the things that you said, which I think is very important, is that when you talked about writing your books and you just said, "Hey, I'm not a master of it, I'm in progress." But one thing you mentioned with writing the books is oftentimes what you wrote were reminders to you, or things that you needed to hear, and you were just really diving in and researching the topic. So talk a little bit about where the idea stemmed from to start with book one, and then book two.
You hit a great point there. And that point is that for me, I've always tried to write the books that I need to be reading. For me, I find it somewhat liberating and therapeutic to write about the very things that are challenging me. So for me, when I decided to write Raise Your Game, my first book, I mean, the initial process of that started in 2017. The book wasn't finished and published till 2019. But my goal was, how can I raise my game, particularly as a speaker? I'm just starting out as a corporate keynote speaker, but what can I do to kind of climb that proverbial mountain? And I really dug in and tried to research that. and did it in a way that, even though it was something that I needed, I tried to write it in a way that others would find value in it as well, where there had to be other people out there that wanted to raise their game in their specific area, whether they were a high school basketball coach or anything else in any other industry. So I wanted to gather the best practices and best information. But the real reason for writing it was I wanted to raise my own game. Fast forward a couple years later, I wanted to figure out, how could I sustain excellence in this new industry? How could I sustain, not implying that I'm at the top of the mountain, because I'll always be on the climb. But if this is something I'm fully committed to doing long term, what can I do to have excellence for a long period of time? And I came to the conclusion that the three things that would undermine that would be stress, stagnation, and burnout. And those were three things that I have and continue to this day struggle with and try to wrestle. So I figured, all right, let's write a book on that, because this is stress, stagnation, and burnout are things I have to get better at if I want to have a long, successful speaking career. So that was why I wrote that book. So for me, it's all about writing and researching what I need, but I also know that I'm not alone, that if it's an issue I'm having, there's a good chance some other people are having the same issue. So the books are always written in service of other people, but the initial impetus is to help me.
I love that. And I think it's very intriguing when you talk about burnout, because the way you've defined burnout is probably the best way I've heard it described. And that is when you're working really hard on something you're misaligned with, right? Or you maybe don't have that passion with. And I think it's fun. How we started the conversation was you talked about your parents being super passionate about, youth, teaching, educating. And you can have a 40-year career in teaching. Someone else can have a 1-year career in teaching and be like, holy smokes, like I'm out. And it's because of the burnout piece, right? The misalignment of the time. If one person can spend 60 hours a week doing one thing and be like, man, I'm ready to do it again next week. The other person after 60 hours could be like, I'm spent, like I can't imagine doing this again. So talk a little bit about ways for people to get in alignment, right? So burnout doesn't happen.
Yeah, in order to avoid burnout, here's what you have to be aware of. If you know that you're going to make a commitment and sacrifices and work long hours, then you need to make sure that those hours you're putting in, you find meaning and purpose in. You need to make sure that you have a curiosity and a fascination with the work that you're doing. It's not boring to you. You need to feel like you are making a contribution to someone or to something, and you need to enjoy it. Find fulfillment in the work. If you can check those boxes, then yeah, you are capable of making massive sacrifices and putting in very long hours, and you're not at risk of burnout. Now, with that said, there is a small caveat. I am a huge advocate of self-care. I'm a huge advocate of getting quality sleep, eating healthy foods, moving our body, taking care of ourselves. So I'm not an advocate of working 18, 19-hour days for long periods of time, because psychological burnout aside, that's physically not sustainable for most people over the long run. We can all do it short term. You can have a final exam that you need to study for and cram in. You might be in the initial startup phases of your business and you have to log some extra hours. You have a proposal that's due. There'll be times where we have short bursts where we can actually burn the candle at both ends, but we need to balance that with proper recovery and rest. So this is by no way me advocating people working longer hours. It's a matter of the hours that you do put in. Just make sure you find meaning and purpose in them, that you are curious and fascinated by your work, that you feel like you're making a contribution. When you check those boxes, then you can absolutely sustain excellence for long periods of time.
I love it. And then to wrap up, I know the public speaking side and keynote speaking has been a very integral part. And I think, at the end of the day, it's being able to take complex situations and boil them down to the basics, right? Which you said, hey, that was just an important pivot and change in my life and the way I look at things. But it's being able to connect with people, right? And I think what your unique ability is you've taken the thing that you spent so much time, working on mastering in basketball, and you found how that parlays into corporate and into businesses. So talk about that for your message of, hey, yeah, my whole life was spent in the basketball arena, but I realized the parlay or, how it caveats into everyday life.
Well, I don't know if this is going to be audio only, but if anyone can see the video, the neon sign above my head says Success Simplified. And that's really kind of my target and my goal at present with my business. I'm a huge believer that in sport and business, complexity undermines execution. If you want people to do something, you need to simplify it as much as possible to get them to do it. That anytime we try to make things unnecessarily complex, then attrition starts to go up. So I believe in simplifying success. And this all stems from that love of the basics and the fundamentals. So part of my work on stage and with groups behind the scenes is helping them clarify and master the fundamentals. I mean, there's not really a sexiness to my work. It's about getting people to fulfill their role to the best of their ability, show up consistently as the best version of themselves so they can make a maximum contribution to the greater good. It's about leaders being able to cast a crystal clear vision and clarifying their mission and their core values, and then holding everyone accountable to a very high standard of excellence. And when you can do that collectively, you see organizational performance shoot through the roof. So as I get older, I realize that the key to success is simplification. You know, we all have heard the adage of you want to add tools to your toolbox. And to a degree, I agree with that. But one thing we have to be very aware of is just adding a tool to your toolbox for no reason just means you're going to lug around a heavier toolbox. You know, if you're not using the one hammer you have, you don't need to add 2 or 3 more hammers. So I'm kind of at a stage in my life where I'm not so much looking to add a lot to my life. I'm looking to untether and let go from the things that are no longer serving me. I'm trying to find out the ways that I am tripping myself up and see if I can let go of some of those paradigms and mindsets so that I'm sticking to a very small handful of core beliefs and values, sticking to the basics and fundamentals, sticking to my personal non-negotiables, and trying to block out everything else. And the more razor sharp I can have with that type of precision, I find that I'm able to go at an unparalleled rate.
I love it. Alan, I could do this for the next 5 hours. I know you have things to get done, though. I just want to say thanks so much for coming on, sharing your journey, sharing a bunch of great nuggets with the listeners. And I'm excited to see what you do in the next 2, 5, 10 years. We'll have to do this again in 2 or 3 years when book number 3 comes out and you've been speaking even more. But thank you again for sharing your journey.
I would love that. That'd be fun. This was a great conversation. Thank you so much.